Hey folks, so time for another Northwind assignment. So let me show you how this works and then we'll talk a little bit about some expectations that I have. So let's assume that Northwind, we've got a substantial collection of products and a substantial collection of employees. And right now there's no correlation between the two of them, but what we want to be able to do is to go to a page where we can start finding employees. And we're going to find them by name. They just have a full name. They don't have I guess you could say they have a first name and last name. I'm just storing their name in terms of how I'm storing it in the Mongo database. But the key thing that you see here is that you've got this filter on the top. You could call it a filter. You could call it a letter picker. Again, this is probably a pretty common thing to do and a good exercise to do in terms of working with Angular. You could think about pulling this sort of thing out as an Angular directive because we're using it in two different places. We're using it for employees. We're using it for products. It basically does the same thing, but with different collections. In essence, it allows you to pick a letter. The other thing that you're seeing here is that some of these are disabled. And they're disabled because there are no employees that start with this letter. So if we go to A, and actually, I'm sorry, I'm on products. So I ended up using something called Faker to put these products in, but these are products that start with A, these are products that start with R, and so on and so forth. And you can only click on, items, letters that actually have products in this case associated with them. And again, if you went back to just the products link, it's not showing you anything. It's only going to show you when you end up filtering on a letter. And the same thing with employees. So if you go to employees, here is, there are no employees whose names begin with Q, U, or Z. So you sort of, we're keeping the user from going down a path where they don't end up finding any data. But if you click on this, you can see that you can end up finding these employees. So that's the basic functionality. There's a lot of different ways to get this to work. Again, if you sort of look at it, you could imagine that you have some functionality, some UI, right, user interface that you are using in a couple of different places, and again, that sort of falls under the category of a directive, and it's just a question on, you could get it to work without using a directive and then figure out how to refactor to turn it into a directive so you don't have the exact same code in two different places. Um, and that's the functionality. Again, there's no relationship at this point between these collections. And again, this thing could seem a little bit overly simplified, but I want to give you a couple of ground rules here. So one of them is that I don't want any client-side filtering. I want all the filtering to take place on the server side, so that I never want you to send back the complete list of products and the complete list of employees. The other thing that you're seeing here is that there's um, not necessarily a nested route, although you could do it with the nested route. But what you're seeing here is that, I'm able to bookmark this. So if I wanted to take this link and send it to someone else, they would load it, and this would be pre-selected for, employees whose names start out with the letter D, employees that start out with the letter S. Again, the bottom line here is that there's some deep linking here in the sense of, if I forward this link to someone else, they'll see the same thing. It's not like, everything is actually, pointing to employees. As you go here, you have a different URL that you can then bookmark. So if you wanted to bookmark, employees that started with the letter V, you could do it by bookmarking this link. So you're only getting, when you end up getting the employees back, you're only getting them back for a particular letter. So again, there's an assumption here that we have this sort of huge data set, and breaking it down by, the letters makes it more palatable in terms of being able to work with on the client. Again, we don't want a ton of stuff that's going to be coming over the wire. And again, this is just a decision here that, I think that restriction ends up making things a little bit more complicated. Again, if you wanted to, you could do all this stuff on the client side, but again, let's just assume that there's just too much data to do that. So we're not going to be doing any client side filtering. We're going to end up doing it on the database. I'll leave you with, however you want to try to implement, this sort of, how to implement this logic to determine, when in fact you don't have any products that end up beginning with these letters. You're going to want to disable that. That again might end up taking a little bit of time to figure out, but it's pretty doable, I think, with everything that we've ended up looking at so far. So a couple of different benchmarks also. Um, the client side code is, you really have to sort of think it out. I think build it up a little bit at a time, but that shouldn't be that long. I mean, we're looking about probably similar to last one, where we're looking probably about 100 lines of client side code, maybe about 100 lines of server side code. Um, and again, I would focus on keeping the code tight, using good naming conventions and good syntax. Again, I mentioned that you could think about, doing this letter picker as a directive. And again, as a starting point, I would say, hey, look, here you have two different routes. And just as a starting point, just make sure that you can end up, you have some data in some products collection. Again, if you're just sort of getting things started, you could show all the products, and you could show all the employees. And then you could think about, well, how do I, not do that? How do I just show when I go to these pages? How do I, show the letters? And then, after you're able to sort of, create these routes, and again, there's going to be an associated, server side route to end up getting these products. And, you might end up, calling a server side route slash API slash products with whatever letter you're passing. Um, but, again, you could sort of build this thing out a little bit at a time. Not necessarily you could display all the letters so that you have these, you're able to navigate to these different states. And then maybe the last thing you do is you say, well, how do I actually go about setting it up so that these are, so I figure out like which of these should be disabled, which of these letters should be enabled, which shouldn't be enabled. And again, that's just going to be based on the data. And again, you could start out, you don't have to have a ton of data to start this out. I started this out by, putting a foo, bar, and baz in the products, and putting, a Mo, Larry, and Curly in an employees collection. And again, the key there is, I think, for all this stuff is just to build it out slowly, get some features to work, get things to show up initially, get your filter to work, and then sort of fine tune your filter so that it gives you a nice UI of not letting a user click on something and drill down to a letter where they're not going to have any results. So I'll just again pop this up again. And, if you find yourself writing a ton of code, you're probably writing too much code. There's, a few different states that you have to worry about. There really aren't going to be that many templates they can end up working with. Again, the server side code should end up being, fairly simplistic. There's going to be a little bit of work that you have to do on the client side. And, again, you could just sort of build that out a little bit at a time. And that's really going to be it. So I expect all of you to work on it. I think some of this is going to be a good experience for what you're going to have to do in the Angular assessment on Thursday. So I want everybody to take a stab at it. Again, it doesn't have to be totally finished. At a bare minimum, if you're just sort of showing listings for those two entities, that's definitely something that I think would, help you in terms of, what we're going to do for the assessment. And again, you could treat it however you want to treat it. If you, wanted to have the ability to delete products, again, that wouldn't be that hard to do. Just, wanting to set up a route and have a delete button here or that sort of thing. But um, you could use your imagination. Again, if you end up making it a lot more, putting a lot more functionality in it, and the code becomes difficult to read, it's going to be difficult for me to give you feedback on it because, again, I have some expectations about what the application should end up looking like. So, again, I would sort of keep it, somewhat simple. You could obviously do a much better job of the display, make it a little bit more interesting, add a little bit of color, give a better, better implementation or better look to this letter picker. but I think you should have some fun with it. Anyway, have a great weekend, and I will see you folks on Tuesday.